What would it take to make you murder your mother? Seriously, think about that for a second. What level of power? What kind of twisted psychology? What circumstances could drive someone to look at the woman who gave them life and decide she has to die? Now imagine that same person controls the most powerful empire in human history, commands armies that could crush entire civilizations, and believes they're not just above the law, but above basic human decency. That person existed, and his name was Nero. But here's the part that'll mess with your head. He didn't start as a monster. He began as a 17-year-old kid with everything going for him, loved by the people, praised by philosophers, and called the golden hope of Rome. So what happened? How does someone go from promising young leader to kicking his pregnant wife to death while composing poetry about the beauty of violence? Picture this nightmare scenario. It's dawn on June 9th, 68 AD, and you're standing outside a crumbling villa 4 miles from Rome. Through the rotting wooden walls, you hear something that'll chill you to the bone. The most powerful man who ever lived is sobbing like a terrified child. This isn't just any crying. This is the desperate, guttural wailing of someone who knows death is coming for them. The stench of fear and human waste fills the air because Nero Claudius Caesar, the 5th Emperor of Rome, has literally wet himself in terror. Blood is pooling around his feet from a botched suicide attempt, and his final words are about to become the most narcissistic last statement in human history. This pathetic creature cowering in a basement once commanded 60 million people, burned cities for entertainment, and murdered his own mother for power. But right now, he's just another scared animal waiting to die. But here's what'll blow your mind. This isn't some random psychopath we're talking about. This was basically the leader of the free world in 68 AD, controlling an empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. Imagine if the President of the United States suddenly decided to become a serial killer, started torturing celebrities for fun, and then tried to burn down Washington, D.C. while live streaming himself singing karaoke. That's essentially what we're dealing with here, except somehow even worse. Nero didn't just abuse his power. He turned the entire Roman Empire into his personal torture chamber and art project. We're talking about a guy who literally kicked his pregnant wife to death, then found a teenage boy who looked like her, castrated him, and forced the kid to marry him while dressed as a woman. And that's just Tuesday for this monster. The craziest part? None of this had to happen. Nero started his reign as what Romans called a golden boy. Young, charismatic, supposedly merciful. People actually had hope for this kid. His first few years looked promising, like maybe Rome had finally found a decent emperor after decades of Caligula's insanity and Claudius's incompetence. But power is like a drug, and Nero was already an addict before he even knew what he was smoking. Every murder made the next one easier. Every act of cruelty opened the door to something worse, until he wasn't even human anymore. Just this grotesque parody of leadership wearing a crown. Think of every dictator who ever promised to make things better. Then ask yourself, how do good intentions turn into absolute evil? Because that transformation is exactly what we're about to witness. What makes Nero's story so terrifying isn't just the scale of his crimes. It's how familiar his psychology feels even today. Strip away the togas in the ancient setting, and you're looking at patterns we recognize from modern narcissists, domestic abusers, and cult leaders. The same manipulation tactics, the same inability to accept responsibility, the same grandiose self-image that justifies any amount of cruelty. Nero believed he was an artist, a misunderstood genius whose victims should feel honored to suffer for his vision. Sound familiar? This isn't just ancient history. It's a playbook that keeps getting used by monsters who convince themselves they're heroes. Every time you see someone with power claiming their critics just don't understand their brilliance while people suffer around them, you're watching Nero's legacy play out in real time. Here's the thing that's going to keep you watching this whole documentary. Nero's downfall is absolutely spectacular. We're talking about the most satisfying villain death in human history, a fall so complete and humiliating that it reads like the finale of the world's darkest Netflix series. This emperor who demanded to be worshipped as a god dies alone in a hole, abandoned by everyone except the victims he created. The man who burned Rome for artistic inspiration ends up begging his own slaves to help him commit suicide because he's too much of a coward to do it himself. And his last words? Not an apology, not regret for the thousands he murdered, but whining about what a great artist the world is losing. If you've ever wanted to see ultimate evil get exactly what it deserves, buckle up because this story delivers justice in the most brutal and satisfying way possible. December 15th, 37 AD. A baby is born who'll make Jeffrey Dahmer look like a choir boy. But here's the twisted part. The moment little Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus entered the world, the first rays of dawn touched his skin, and ancient Romans would later claim this was an omen of his fiery nature. Think about that for a second. Even his birth came with a warning label. This wasn't just any Roman family either. This was a bloodline so steeped in violence and cruelty that their family reunions probably looked like scenes from a horror movie. We're talking about generations of psychopaths who made murder their family business, passing down sadistic tendencies, like most families pass down recipes or holiday traditions. His great-great-grandfather literally rode through battle on an elephant while displaying severed heads like Christmas ornaments. His grandfather gouged out a Roman knight's eye in the middle of the forum just for talking back to him. But wait, it gets worse. Because baby Nero's immediate family was about to prove that the apple doesn't just fall close to the tree, it lands right in the same pit of evil. Meet Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero's father, a man so vicious that when friends congratulated him on his son's birth, he replied with bone-chilling honesty, "Nothing that is not abominable and a public curse could be born of Agrippina and myself." Let that sink in for a moment. Your own father basically calling you a future monster before you can even walk. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Those weren't just the bitter words of a disappointed parent. They were a prophecy that would prove horrifyingly accurate. This was a guy who killed one of his own freed slaves just for refusing to drink as much as he wanted at a party, ran over a child with his chariot in the Roman Forum for fun, and once gouged out a Roman knight's eye during an argument. When people like this are calling their own offspring a future menace to society, you know something seriously dark is brewing. The kid was basically born with a genetic predisposition to violence, raised in an environment where cruelty was normal, and surrounded by role models who treated human life like disposable entertainment. But the real architect of Nero's future monstrosities was his mother, Agrippina the Younger. And folks, this woman makes Lady Macbeth look like Mother Teresa. Picture the most manipulative, power-hungry person you've ever met. Give them imperial blood, unlimited ambition, and absolutely zero moral boundaries. Then multiply that by about 1,000. Agrippina was a sister of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, and she possessed what might be the most dangerous combination in human history, royal bloodline plus sociopathic intelligence. She'd already been exiled once for plotting against her own brother, had already buried one husband under extremely suspicious circumstances, and was already scheming to place her 3-year-old son on the throne of the known world. When little Nero's father conveniently died of dropsy, though many whispered poison, she inherited a third of his estate, which Emperor Caligula promptly seized along with the rest of the family wealth. Suddenly Agrippina found herself exiled to a barren island, while her toddler son was left with nothing but 2 servants, a dancer and a barber. Talk about hitting rock bottom. But here's where Agrippina proved she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. When Caligula got himself assassinated in 41 AD and her stammering Uncle Claudius stumbled onto the throne, she didn't just see an opportunity, she saw her destiny. First move: seduce and marry Gaius Sallustius Pacinus, one of the richest men in Rome, who conveniently died soon after their wedding, leaving her his entire fortune. Coincidence? Not likely. Second move: set her sights on the ultimate prize, Emperor Claudius himself. Now, picture the setup. Claudius already had a wife, Messalina, a woman whose sexual appetites were legendary even by Roman standards. But Messalina made one fatal mistake. She went through an actual marriage ceremony with her lover Gaius while still married to the emperor. Whether it was drunken stupidity or an actual coup attempt didn't matter. Agrippina saw her opening and moved in for the kill. By 49 AD, she had convinced her drooling 60-year-old uncle to not only divorce his wife, but marry his own niece, despite Roman law forbidding such unions. When you're plotting to rule the world, apparently incest is just another Tuesday. The moment 12-year-old Lucius watched his mother become Empress of Rome, his path to ultimate power was sealed. But more importantly, his transformation into a monster officially began. Agrippina wasted absolutely no time turning her son into the perfect weapon for her ambitions. She convinced Claudius to adopt the boy, instantly changing his name to Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Notice how that rolls off the tongue like a threat. At 13, he received the toga of manhood in a ceremony that was basically ancient Rome's way of saying, this kid is now legally an adult. At 14, he was proclaimed heir to the throne, leapfrogging over Claudius's own biological son Britannicus, like he didn't even exist. At 15, they married him off to Claudius's daughter Octavia, making him not just the heir but also the emperor's son-in-law. It was a political masterstroke that would make modern campaign managers weep with envy, except there was one tiny problem. Agrippina was getting impatient, and when this woman got impatient, people started dying. The stage was set for the most shocking family murder in Roman history, but you'll never guess who was about to become the victim. October 54 AD, Emperor Claudius sits down for what he thinks is just another dinner, but he's actually about to eat his last meal. The official story claimed stomach problems from bad mushrooms, but everyone in Rome knew the truth. Agrippina had finally gotten tired of waiting for natural causes and decided to speed things up with a little culinary creativity. Some accounts suggest that when the first dose of poison mushrooms wasn't quite lethal enough, she called in professional help from a woman named Lusta, a specialist in creative assassination, who finished the job with a feather dipped in toxin, thrust down the emperor's throat while pretending to help him vomit. Picture Claudius's final moments, convulsing in agony as poison ate through his insides, probably realizing too late that his beautiful young wife had been planning his death since their wedding night. At 17 years old, Nero became master of the known world, and the early signs seemed almost promising. When asked to sign his first death warrant, he famously said, "How I wish I had never learned to write." He reduced taxes, gave generous gifts to people, promised to rule with mercy. But those closest to him were already seeing cracks in the facade that would soon become a complete psychological collapse. The first murder was planned with the meticulous care of a surgeon and the cold calculation of a chess master. The target? Britannicus, Claudius's biological son and Nero's stepbrother, a quiet 14-year-old boy who had never shown the slightest ambition for power, but whose very existence represented a potential threat to Nero's reign. In the young emperor's increasingly paranoid mind, blood trumped adoption, and as long as Britannicus lived, there would always be whispers about the real heir to Claudius's legacy. The murder itself was a masterpiece of public theater designed to send a message to anyone else who might question Nero's legitimacy. It happened during a dinner party in the palace, surrounded by the elite of Roman society, with the victim's own family watching helplessly as their son and brother was slowly poisoned to death. Britannicus called for his wine to be cooled with water, a perfectly normal request, but the water had been treated with poison by the same professional killer who had helped murder Claudius. As the gathered guests watched in absolute horror, the boy took a single sip and immediately began convulsing, his face turning blue, his eyes rolling back, his young body racked with spasms as the toxin burned through his veins like liquid fire. And through it all, Nero kept eating calmly, chatting with dinner guests as if nothing unusual was happening, even suggesting it was just an epileptic fit when someone expressed concern. But this was just the appetizer, because what came next would make this murder look like mercy. You think your family drama's bad? Imagine having your own mother assassinated. That's exactly what Nero did. Agrippina, his mother, his maker, the very woman who pulled political strings to place that crown on his head, became his greatest threat. She knew too much, wanted too much, and loved control even more than he did. So Nero plotted her death. First attempt? A custom-built boat rigged to collapse and drown her in the Bay of Naples. But Agrippina swam ashore, bruised, furious, alive. So Nero gave up on theatrics and sent in assassins with swords. The woman who gave him life was stabbed to death in her own home. And just like that, Rome learned that no one, not even blood, was safe in the emperor's paranoia. Agrippina had raised a monster, and she died knowing it. This wasn't politics. This was Shakespearean tragedy brought to life. And Nero was just getting started. With his mother out of the way, Nero turned his gaze to his young wife, Octavia, quiet, noble, and in his eyes disposable. She wasn't exciting enough, not dramatic enough for a man now high on absolute power. So he accused her of adultery, banished her, and when public outcry erupted in her defense, He had her executed. Her head was delivered to his new lover, Poppaea Sabina, the ambitious, calculating woman who'd been waiting in the wings. Nero didn't love. He conquered. He collected women the way modern fans collect celebrity autographs. Only his obsession didn't end in admiration. It ended in blood. Poppaea soon replaced Octavia, not just in title, but in the emperor's twisted theater of desire. Rome watched horrified as marriages became performances and women became casualties. This wasn't a love story. It was a horror show scripted by a narcissist with no boundaries. And the next act would set the entire world on fire. Then came the night of July 18th, 64 AD. It started with a flicker on the Aventine Hill. But by dawn, the Eternal City was engulfed in a hellish blaze. Rome burned for 6 days. Entire districts crumbled into ash. The sky glowed red as temples, homes, and markets vanished. Thousands died. Survivors wandered the streets like ghosts, coughing through smoke, clutching children, searching for anything that hadn't turned to cinders. And where was Nero, the man who was supposed to lead, protect, command? He was miles away, playing the lyre and singing. Eyewitnesses claim he stood atop his golden palace balcony, dressed in stage costume, performing a musical epic as Rome collapsed beneath him. Imagine your city is burning, your neighbors are dying, and your emperor is hosting the most expensive concert in history. To Nero, it was all part of the show. The fire wasn't tragedy. It was a stage. And Nero had just claimed the spotlight. Just when you think Emperor Nero has reached his limit, he crosses a line that shocks even ancient Rome. In a moment of pure rage, he strikes his pregnant wife, Poppaea Sabina, with a brutal kick to the abdomen. She collapses, and neither she nor the unborn child survives. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't some palace accident whispered about in court. It was a violent, personal execution born from Nero's unchecked fury. The same man who once wrote poetry about love and beauty now murders the woman he claimed to adore. But grief doesn't humble him. It twists him even further. Soon after, he begins searching for someone to replace Poppaea, not emotionally but physically. And that's when he sees him, a teenage boy with soft features and haunting familiarity. His name is Sporus. And what Nero does next will make you question not just his sanity, but his humanity. Nero orders Sporus to be castrated, stripped not only of his manhood, but of any chance at a normal life. He dresses him in the empress's gowns, paints his face like a porcelain doll, and publicly refers to him as Poppaea. Then, in front of the Roman elite, he marries him in a mock ceremony that blurs the lines between power, delusion, and depravity. Sporus becomes a living ghost, a tribute to a dead queen, forced to relive her memory at Nero's side. This isn't just abuse. It's psychological torture on an imperial scale. Imagine a teenager, mutilated and forced into a role he never asked for, paraded through Rome in the shadow of a tyrant's grief. And as Rome watches, many turn their heads, whispering in fear, wondering what Nero is becoming. This was no longer the emperor they once knew. This was a man possessed by loss, by ego, and by an obsession that consumed his soul. As Nero's madness deepens, he turns away from governance entirely and toward theater. He isn't leading the empire. He's auditioning for Olympus. He travels to Greece not for diplomacy or war, but to perform on stage as a musician, a poet, an actor. Nero sings ballads and recites verses, demanding standing ovations under threat of execution. He forces the elite to watch, clap, and worship him, not as a ruler, but as an artist. While Rome is collapsing under economic ruin, military unrest, and social decay, Nero is out collecting prizes, participation trophies handed to him by terrified hosts. It's as if the emperor of the world has mistaken the fall of civilization for a festival. Meanwhile, legions in Gaul, Spain, and Judea grow restless. Rebellions spark like dry grass catching fire. The once loyal provinces now plot in whispers. Nero may be on stage, basking in false applause, but beyond the curtain, the empire he inherited is coming apart stitch by stitch. But every act must end, and even the most deluded performer eventually faces the final curtain. Back in Rome, the Senate begins to stir. Generals question their loyalty. Citizens speak Nero's name not with reverence, but with disgust. The same people who once feared his wrath now crave his downfall. Behind palace doors, Sporus continues to play the part of a dead queen, a living monument to Nero's madness. But outside, a storm brews. Karma is not just coming. It's arriving with an army. Governors revolt. Armies march. And Rome, ancient, proud, and bleeding, prepares to reclaim itself. Nero will soon discover that no matter how many crowns he collects, no matter how loud the applause, history does not forget cruelty, and it does not forgive delusion. The question now is not whether Nero will fall, but how far he will crash when the spotlight finally fades, and who will be standing in the shadows, waiting to take his place. By 68 AD, reality finally caught up with Nero. The provinces were no longer whispering. They were roaring. Spain revolted. Gaul joined in. The once loyal Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, abandoned him in the dead of night. Rome turned cold. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The emperor, who once basked in ovations, now heard nothing but silence. The streets that once echoed with cheers became filled with marching feet and angry chants. Nero had ruled over 60 million people. Now he ruled nothing. No throne, no army, no allies. His golden palace stood empty. His power had evaporated overnight, and what was left was a desperate man, pacing, sweating, trembling. The empire he believed he was born to dominate was finally pushing back. And in that moment, stripped of titles, stripped of glory, he wasn't a god or a performer or a leader. He was just a man running out of time, cornered and alone. Nero fled to the dark, not like an emperor, but like a hunted animal, disguised in rags. He crept through back alleys and slithered through a narrow tunnel under cover of night. This was the same man who once commanded legions, who dined on gold plates and burned cities for fun, now crawling on hands and knees like a rat. He begged a few remaining slaves for help. One offered shelter in a suburban villa's basement. And it's there, hidden beneath the floorboards of a crumbling estate, that our story comes full circle. From the gilded halls of the Palatine to a dirt-stained hole in the ground. Nero knew what was coming. The Senate had declared him to be flogged to death in the Forum, a punishment reserved for the worst of criminals. His only way out? Suicide. But in true Nero fashion, even that didn't go as planned. Nero couldn't go through with it. He sobbed. He panicked. He begged one of his remaining attendants to help him finish the job. And finally, with trembling hands and a borrowed blade, Nero stabbed himself in the neck. But even then, he missed a vital artery. It wasn't instant. It was slow, ugly, and unceremonious. The man who once believed he was a god, who demanded the world bow at his feet, died choking on his own blood in a basement no bigger than a prison cell. And his final words? Not repentance, not apology. He whispered, Qualis artifact for Rio, one artist dies in me. Seriously? No mention of the people he murdered. No thought for Rome. Just one last, delusional cry for attention. You weren't Beethoven, Nero. You were a tyrant with a god complex. And Rome? She survived you. She always does. Because no matter how big the fire, the ashes still remember. 68 AD. Reality finally catches up, and when karma comes for Nero, she brings a whole squad. Picture this. You wake up one morning as the most powerful person on earth, and by nightfall, you're running for your life. That's exactly what happened when news started flooding into Rome, that the provinces were done with Nero's BS. First, it was Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul saying, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. Then Galba in Spain joined the party with an actual army. Even Africa, usually the chill province that just sent grain and minded its business, started showing signs of we're over the psychopath. But here's where it gets wild. Nero's first reaction wasn't fear or strategic planning. This delusional maniac got excited because he thought rebellions would give him more opportunities for dramatic revenge fantasies. He started composing songs about how he'd punish the rebels and designing theatrical execution methods. While professional generals were marching on Rome with trained legions, Nero was in his palace playing dress-up and writing poetry about their future deaths. It's like bringing a guitar to a gunfight and thinking you'll win because your song is really catchy. The moment that changed everything came on June 68 AD, when Nero discovered what true loneliness feels like. He went to bed still believing he was untouchable, still surrounded by his Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who were supposed to die for their emperor. But when he woke up that morning, the palace was eerily quiet. Too quiet. His bodyguards had literally noped out in the middle of the night, probably thinking, "We're not dying for this theater kid." Can you imagine that level of abandonment? These were men who'd sworn sacred oaths to protect him, who'd been paid fortunes to ensure his safety, and they just left. No dramatic confrontation, no grand betrayal scene. They simply decided that guarding Nero wasn't worth their lives anymore and ghosted him harder than a bad Tinder date. Even worse, when he called for his other attendants, he discovered that slaves were looting his private chambers, fighting over his golden statues and jewelry, like Black Friday shoppers. The same people who used to bow and scrape at his presence were now stealing his stuff while he was still in the building. That's not just abandonment. That's the universe's way of saying you're done, bro. But the real gut punch came when the Senate, those spineless yes-men who'd rubber-stamped everyone's atrocities, suddenly grew a backbone and declared him a public enemy. The sentence? Death by fustuarium, which sounds fancy until you realize it means being stripped naked, having your head locked in a wooden fork, and being beaten to death with rods while crowds watch and cheer. They wanted to give him the same kind of theatrical death he'd inflicted on so many others. Except this time, he'd be the star of his own execution. Nero's response to impending doom was exactly what you'd expect from a narcissistic coward. He decided to run away like a scared child. But even his escape plan was pathetic. First, he wanted to flee to Egypt because he thought the Egyptians would appreciate his artistic genius. When no one would help him get there, he begged various friends to hide him. One by one, they all refused, probably thinking, harbor the most hated man in the empire? Hard pass. Finally, his freedman Phaon offered a villa outside Rome, and Nero jumped at it like it was a five-star resort instead of the rat hole where he'd meet his end. The journey to Phaon's villa was the most humiliating road trip in history. The man who used to travel in golden chariots surrounded by hundreds of servants was now sneaking through the darkness on foot, wearing a dirty cloak to hide his face, accompanied by just 4 people. Phaon, Epaphroditus his secretary, Neophytus his valet, and Sporus. The castrated boy still dressed as a woman, because apparently even fleeing for your life doesn't excuse you from Nero's twisted fantasies. They had to avoid main roads where soldiers might recognize them, stumbling through fields and olive groves like common criminals. At one point, Nero had a drink from a muddy puddle because he was thirsty, and this man who only drank from jewel cups acted like it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. But the real low point came when they reached the villa and realized they couldn't use the front door. Too risky. So these geniuses decided to dig a tunnel under the building. That's right, the Emperor of Rome, descendant of Augustus, ruler of the known world, ended up crawling through dirt on his hands and knees like a rat trying to find a hole to hide in. If karma had a sense of humor, this was her standing ovation moment. Once inside that cramped basement, reality hit Nero harder than a ton of Roman concrete. This wasn't some temporary setback he could sing his way out of. This was the end, and everyone knew it. Messages kept arriving with increasingly terrible news. Galba was already in Rome. The Senate had confirmed the death sentence, and soldiers were actively hunting for him. But here's where Nero's character showed itself in all its pathetic glory. Instead of facing death with even a shred of dignity, he spent hours crying, whining, and begging his companions to kill themselves first so he wouldn't have to die alone. Imagine being such a coward that you can't even face death without trying to drag others down with you. He kept proclaiming that the world was losing a great artist, that future generations would mourn the loss of his talent. Sporus, still trapped in his feminine costume, sat in the corner probably wondering if death might actually be better than continuing this insane performance. The other servants exchanged glances that clearly said, "How did our lives lead to this moment?" But time was running out. They could hear horses approaching, soldiers getting closer, and Nero still couldn't bring himself to act. His suicide attempt itself was such a complete failure that it would be funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Nero held the dagger for what felt like hours, bringing it to his throat then pulling away, like a kid afraid to jump off the high dive. He kept asking for help, begging someone to show him how to kill himself properly, as if suicide came with an instruction manual. Finally, with soldiers literally at the door, he made a weak thrust at his throat, but surprise, surprise, even killing himself was beyond his abilities. The blade went in at the wrong angle, missing the major arteries, causing pain but not death. He collapsed to the floor, making horrible gurgling sounds, blood flowing but not fast enough to end his misery. It took Epaphroditus, his secretary, to grab the dagger and finish the job properly, driving it deep enough to hit something vital. And even then, with blood pooling around his head and death finally claiming him, Nero managed to gasp out the most narcissistic last words in history. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. Not, I'm sorry for the thousands I murdered. Not, forgive me for burning Rome. Not even, I regret being a monster. Nope. This psychopath's final thought was that the world was losing a great artist. Bro, you were a serial killer who happened to own a lyre, not Beethoven. The delusion lasted literally until his last breath. When soldiers finally burst into that basement and found Nero's corpse, the scene was almost too perfect. The mighty emperor who terrorized millions reduced to a bloody mess on a dirty floor, surrounded by the human wreckage of his own cruelty. Sporus, still in his woman's clothes, kneeling beside the man who destroyed his life. The servants who'd helped him die knowing they'd probably be executed for assisting. The contrast between how Nero saw himself, a misunderstood artistic genius, and how he actually died, a coward in the basement begging for help to kill himself, was the universe's final judgment on his worthless life. The soldiers probably expected to find some dignity in death, some final glimpse of imperial power. Instead, they found exactly what Nero had always been underneath the purple robes and golden crowns, a pathetic, delusional narcissist who couldn't even die properly without someone holding his hand. And that, folks, is how the monster of Rome met his end, not with a bang, not with artistic grandeur, but with a whimper that echoed through history as the most fitting end of the most unfitting emperor who ever lived. When news of Nero's death hit the streets of Rome, something unprecedented happened. The entire empire threw the biggest party in human history. We're talking about celebrations that made New Year's Eve in Times Square look like a quiet dinner party. From Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria, people literally danced in the streets for days. Merchants gave away free wine. Slaves were granted temporary freedom to join the festivities, and citizens placed flowers on the graves of Nero's victims, while tearing down every statue of the dead emperor they could find. Think about that level of hatred for a second. This wasn't just one city celebrating. This was 3 continents collectively exhaling after holding their breath for 14 years. The Roman Senate moved so fast to erase Nero from history that you'd think they were trying to set a world record. They ordered his name chiseled off every monument, melted down his statues for scrap metal, and removed his face from coins like he was some kind of ancient unperson. But here's the thing. You can't erase a monster that big from memory, and maybe that's exactly the point. Because here's what should really keep you up at night. Nero wasn't some unique aberration in human history. He was just a prototype for every narcissistic dictator who would follow. Strip away the togas and ancient Roman setting, and tell me you don't recognize this playbook. A charismatic leader who promises to make things great again, who slowly tests boundaries with increasingly cruel acts, who surrounds himself with yes-men while eliminating anyone who dares to criticize, who treats human suffering as entertainment while claiming to be a misunderstood genius. Sound familiar? Every time a leader starts calling the press enemies of the people, every time someone with power claims their critics just don't understand their vision, every time we see cruelty justified as necessary for some greater good, we're watching Nero's ghost take another victory lap. The scariest part isn't that monsters like Nero existed in ancient times. It's that we keep creating the exact same conditions that allow them to rise. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt. It reveals who someone really was all along, and some people were monsters just waiting for permission. But there's also a lesson of hope buried in this nightmare, and it's written in the ruins of Nero's golden palace. See, after his death, subsequent emperors didn't just tear down his obscene monument to narcissism. They filled it with concrete and built something better on top. Where Nero's private pleasure dome once stood, they erected the Colosseum, a public amphitheater where regular Romans could gather for entertainment. where one man's ego had consumed a third of the city. They created a space for the people. It's poetic justice on an architectural scale, the ultimate middle finger to tyranny carved in stone and concrete. Today, millions of tourists visit the Colosseum without realizing they're literally standing on top of buried evil. Proof that even the worst monsters can be overcome and transformed into something that serves humanity instead of enslaving it. Sometimes history doesn't just record events. It actively corrects them, turning symbols of oppression into monuments of collective triumph. Nero wanted to be remembered as a great artist. Instead, he's remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when we give unstable people unlimited power. The truth is, every society is always just one bad decision away from creating its own Nero. All it takes is citizens who stop paying attention, who trade freedom for entertainment, who let small abuses of power slide because confronting them seems too difficult. Nero didn't become a monster overnight. He was created step by step, murder by murder, while good people stood by and said nothing because they were either too scared or too comfortable to act. His mother enabled him. His advisors covered for him. The Senate rubber-stamped his crimes, and the people cheered at his performances while their neighbors disappeared in the night. By the time everyone realized what they created, it was too late to stop him through normal means. The only solution was complete collapse, civil war, and starting over from scratch. That's the price of letting monsters grow unchecked. Not just the lives they take, but the destruction of everything you built. So yeah, Nero got what was coming to him in that basement. Cry like the coward he always was. But the real question is, how many people had to die before Rome finally said enough? Look, I know this story was dark, probably darker than anything you expected to hear today. But that's exactly why we need to tell it. Not because we enjoy dwelling on humanity's worst moments, but because forgetting them guarantees we'll repeat them. Every generation thinks they're too smart, too civilized, too advanced to fall for the same tricks that destroyed previous societies. But the truth is, we're all just one charismatic sociopath away from our own Nero, and the only defense is knowing the warning signs. So if this story disturbed you, good, it should. If it made you think about current events in a different light, even better. And if it made you appreciate the boring stability of democratic institutions and checks on power, then we've done our job. Because at the end of the day, the difference between a functioning society and Nero's Rome isn't that much. It's just whether we're willing to stop the monsters before they gain enough power to stop us. So here's your homework. Pay attention, ask questions, and never, ever assume it can't happen here. Because somewhere out there, another Nero is waiting for their chance. And the only thing standing in their way is people like you who know their history. If you made it through this entire nightmare of a story, first of all, respect. This wasn't easy stuff to hear. But you stuck with it because you understand that sometimes the darkest chapters of history teach the most important lessons. So do us a favor. Smash that like button harder than Nero's ego got smashed in that basement. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we're just getting started on exploring history's most twisted minds. And here's what I really want to know. Drop a comment telling me which historical monster terrifies you the most. Is it Caligula, who made Nero look sane by comparison? Vlad the Impaler, who turned torture into an art form? Or maybe someone more recent who proved these patterns never really stop? Let me know, because your comments literally determine what nightmare we dive into next. And hey, share this video with that one friend who thinks they know everything about history. I guarantee Nero's story will show them just how dark humanity can really get. Until next time, remember, those who don't learn from history aren't just doomed to repeat it. They're doomed to become its victims. Peace out, and seriously, hug your democracy tonight.